Well, there have been comparisons made between the situation in Crimea and what happened between Russia and Georgia in 2008. Mikheil Saakashvili, who was the president of Georgia at the time, sent forces into the territory of South Ossetia, which it claimed ownership of. But Russia responded to what it called an invasion with massive firepower and widespread aerial bombardment. More than 800 people lost their lives in the five-day war. Well, let's speak to the former Georgian president, live now to Dublin, to Mr. Saakashvili. Very good evening to you. We'll come to what happened in Georgia in just a moment. But first of all, what do you think President Putin's long-term plan is here?
Well, I think President Putin has a very clear goal here. There are several goals. If Ukraine makes it, becomes European and democratic state, then the Russian citizens will be asking why Russians cannot have the same, why they should live in mafia-ridden, oligarchic, corrupt country. The other thing is Crimea has lots of gas, shale gas. Actually, within the next 3 years, thanks to American companies, Ukraine was going to become next exporter of gas and stop buying Russian gas. That would basically mean that Gazprom would lose the biggest supplier of gas in Europe. And that's something that is really rarely talked of, but that was a very important factor, I'm sure. And then there is the whole thing that Putin has this plan to have occupation and basically annexation of territories ranging from South Ossetia, Abkhazia, the Crimea, then the other parts of Ukraine, southern Ukraine, and then Transnistria in Moldova. And indeed, they announced they moved the referendum to closer date. They announced the goal of referendum is to annex Crimea by Russia, and it's exactly the same scheme. And I'm afraid the same would apply to Georgian territory. It's exactly the same scheme how Germany annexed Sudetenland. And now you mentioned in the beginning that we moved troops and Russia responded, but that's total, absolute bullshit. Because we were doing, they were doing exactly the same thing as they're doing Crimea. If now Ukraine responds, then some people in the West will be saying, well, they moved and then Russia responding. Of course, it's not true. Of course, it's nonsense spread by Russian propaganda. Indeed, what happened, we had many weeks of provocations. Then we had mass shootout by Russian troops that Russia were claiming were not its troops, exactly the same way how it's claiming now in Crimea. And then Georgian government responded to what exactly the kind of troops now they have on the ground in Crimea. If Ukrainian government responds now, Russia would say, well, those were not our troops, and now we are moving with real troops. That's exactly what happened in Georgia. And it's high time now for people who still propagate this rubbish version that we attacked first to reconsider this absolute being victim of Russian lies. I have nothing else to say about that. Well,
let me ask you then, if Ukraine does respond to what's happening in Crimea, will there be a war?
Well, there was war in Georgia because we couldn't afford in Georgia what Ukraine can afford. If for Russian troops to get to their capital, Kiev, it would take much longer than it would take them to get from South Ossetia to my capital, Tbilisi. I had to respond because Russian troops already invaded my country. They were not claiming it were, they were claiming it weren't their troops. Exactly the same way how Putin shamelessly says that some people just purchased Russian uniform, high-tech Russian weapons or foreign weapons, and they're just by accident there, some kind of extraterrestrials, and Russia had nothing to do with it. So if Ukraine responds, then Russia will say, now we are really responding to Ukraine, now we are moving. That's why we had to do it, because from South Ossetia to Georgia's capital, a few hours. Now to get from eastern border or from southern border to Ukraine's capital, it's much longer. So Ukraine has this luxury to exercise restraint, to wait, to exercise patience. But on the other hand, no country can tolerate occupation of its territory. So my advice to Ukrainian leaders, and I've been very in close touch with all of them. In fact, I came together with them tonight to Dublin with some of them, was, of course, it's a nice thing to have restraint. Of course, I understand that they should be very, very careful. On the other hand, they should prepare for the worst, because you see, Putin is in a hurry. He's trying to play on division between European allies. European Union's response today was still quite mixed, because they are saying Russia should talk to Ukraine. Now, it's not about conditioning that they should talk. It's about that fact that Russia should deoccupy, Russia should leave what it has just grabbed. Because otherwise Putin would lay down, just consume what he grabbed, and then say, okay, we'll talk for the next 10 years.
So would it mean... Yes, yeah. I apologise for interrupting you. If Europe was to be stronger, if America was even stronger than it was today, would it have an impact, you think? Or does Putin simply not care about being isolated in the global community?
Well, I think Putin cares a lot. Putin is not North Korean leader. Putin is not Iranian. Ahmadinejad. I mean, Putin cares a lot. Putin. Somebody said that Putin wants to attack and occupy like Stalin, but live like Rockefeller. And he lives much better than Rockefeller. He has much more money than any American billionaire ever had. So actually, he's one of the most. He's the corrupt official that has most of the money that anybody has ever controlled in recent history. So this guy certainly is all about luxury. His people are all about their nice house in South France or Florida, bank accounts in the West. He himself goes in enjoying, skiing all over Europe, having nice lifestyle, luxury lifestyle in Russia, but mostly also in Europe and in America. His family members live abroad, as far as I know, in Netherlands. So, the guy really likes to have fun. And you cannot really have fun if you are shut off from the West. But he is so cynical that he thinks he can have both. He can grab lands like Stalin, but Stalin used to sleep on a couch and have very modest lifestyle. And that's not what is true about Putin. So actually, he's very vulnerable, unlike Stalin or North Korea or whatever.
Yes, the White House has said tonight that he will not be on the list for those who will have visa restrictions, despite probably being in charge of whatever military movers there are in Crimea. If the West was tough, would it have an impact in resolving this crisis then? Absolutely.
That's the only way. Ukraine on its own, as well as Georgia on its own, cannot solve it. Ukraine can just, take weapons and defend itself, but it would be a nightmare. If we want to avoid new big war in Europe, and I mean, I have to remind you that Ukraine is bigger than the former Yugoslavia. It's really a thing for, it has a huge disruption potential there. We have now not only Crimea as a hotspot, but there are, provocateurs coming to Donbass. The guys have watch set on Moscow time. There's 1 hour difference between Kiev and Moscow. There are thousands of people going around in eastern regions that have watch. They didn't even bother to change watch time. They appoint some governor whom nobody knows there. In Odessa, there are provocateurs from Chechnya and Transnistria, Moldova, again coming to stir up trouble. So there are lots of flashpoints all over Ukraine, and it's a miracle. By so far, it has not gone into really hot war. But it's really we're running against the time here. Remember, and their patients are running high in Kiev. There are lots of armed people in Kiev. I was there. There are long lines of young people lining up to join the army, and Ukraine has lots of weapons and has good officers. Big part of, by the way, Russian officers are Ukrainian. So, there is this big potential for conflict. But it can only be resolved. I mean, they can start conflict between two of them, but to stop conflict, it really takes international community around it to consolidate efforts and not to buy Russian propaganda, because, again, Russia have been investing heavily, and I've heard some people in Britain are worried that real estate prices will fall in London City because all corrupt Russians buy houses there. Some other people are worried about the other deals that German companies have with the Russians. I understand that. I understand the Westerners have to take care of their companies, but it's a very short term. In medium and long term, it will be ultimate disaster if Europe is against Putin to a situation where there will be a large-scale war on the continent. Then it will really destroy the whole business. So that takes upon the real politicians to think beyond the whole thing. Winston Churchill was before the Second World War, and politicians back then had also same consideration. Well, we had to engage Hitler because we had to contain Soviets. There were deals between Germany and the others, but then it was a nightmare because he grabbed Sudetenland and they were keeping it to fit one country after another. After Churchill came in and said, "What the hell are we doing? We need to stop this guy, otherwise we'll all be destroyed." We don't have churches out there, but we have experience now. We have experience of what...
It might be you, I think. Mikheil Saakashvili, very good to talk to you. Interesting times, and certainly a full coverage of what is indeed flashpoints across Ukraine. Thank you very much indeed. Mikheil Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia, talking to us live there from Dublin.